you here in person, but we will have to make do given the situation. But let me just begin by introducing Brian and then turning it over to him for a talk, encouraging as he talks all of you to sort of put questions or comments that you have into the Q&A so that we can address those when Brian has finished. So Brian has a really interesting background in human rights, and he is currently the lead researcher and advisor for the US for Amnesty International, is based in Washington, D.C. He previously worked as a human rights advisor for OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and was on a number of OCSC missions before that to Ukraine and to Kosovo. And before that, he worked for OHCHR in Nepal. But I think my favorite fact about Brian is that he used to work for Mother Jones magazine, which is not as well known as it should be. It's a great classic lefty magazine. And so without further ado, let me turn it over to Brian, who will be talking to us about kind of the legacy of human rights in the US as a result of the Trump years and what we can look forward to now. And I think towards the end, we'll kind of talk to us about what it's been like to be doing rights research and human rights advocacy in the US during a very difficult 4 years for human rights. So thanks again, Brian, for joining us, and I'll mute myself and turn it over to you.
Hi, Lars, thanks so much. Hi, everyone. Nice to join you. And indeed, I wish that I could be there in person, not only to see old friends and professors at Essex, but also just for the dynamic of being able to chat in person. And I'm very grateful for the invitation. And I did look through some of the other HRC Speaker Series events that you've had recently and streamed online. And since I'm sure that in such a rigorous and intensive academic program, people have already had their fill of death by PowerPoint by this time in the year, I'd like to keep it pretty conversational, which of course would be easier in person. But in terms of the matter of this, as you might have gotten from the sense of the framing of the topic, after I chatted briefly with Andrew about it, I'm hoping to look very kind of generally and outline the human rights record of the U.S. Recently, but still, this is such a huge area. Kind of what it, where the record stands at this point now, moving forward, at this inflection point, right? This kind of watershed moment where we've been through quite a last 4 years, and I'd like to look at some of the issues that may be relevant and timely for your own studies at the Human Rights Center, specifically about where international standards come into play with what's been going on both in the U.S. domestically and how it pertains to international affairs and standards. And then, you know, based on that kind of inflection point now, what the human rights outlook is moving forward under the new presidential administration of Joe Biden. And I suppose much of this is going to be kind of an outline of a few key areas that I think have been particularly engaged over the last few years by the conduct of American domestic and foreign policy. But then I'd like to also talk a little bit, as Lars was saying closer to the end, about what it's like to do human rights work in a country like the U.S. after having been in, you know, conflict and post-conflict spaces and doing, you know, work with the OSCE, which is kind of an institution building talk shop. And all of those skills are actually quite relevant to doing human rights work at home for me, but really at home for anyone. And I think this is something I remember from studying at Essex was people have different goals and objectives in their own professional careers. And sometimes that's related to going home to the country from which they came to do human rights work there. And very often it's really kind of this globe-trotting ethos and lifestyle of going to some really far-flung places and living in in Geneva or in New York or other nerve centers for the human rights movement. And I think that really a lot of the skills are the same on both sides. So I'll try to touch on that as well, and end with a few photos to give kind of a more human portrait about what some of the let's call it field work, for lack of a better term, looks like when going into a few of these issues. Lars, how long do I have? And please keep me to time.
Don't worry, how long? You have about 40 minutes. No problem.
Oh, okay, should be plenty. Okay, so right. Through the personal lens, I moved back to the U.S. in 2017, the year that Trump was inaugurated, and it seemed like a very good time to come back to the U.S. For a variety of reasons. As some Essex friends joked at the time when I'd announced it, oh wow, trading one emergency human rights situation for another, and it really was something like that because whereas under the previous administrations, there was a variety of different human rights problems at play. At least they were characterized by an overall respect for the rule of law. And we had the rule of law tossed slightly out the window at the start of the Trump administration. And it seemed like the best time possible to come back to the US and try to apply some of the lessons learned and standards studied at Essex and through past work to the situation in the US in a meaningful way. And it was interesting arriving in Washington, D.C. in 2017, not only because of the Trump administration, but also because of the mood in general among the other countries who are represented here. Because as those of you may know who have been to Washington, D.C., it's like a city of embassies. And it's such has a very cosmopolitan but international character, while at the same time being a very American seat of power. And it was interesting hearing from colleagues at embassies, for instance, oh, don't worry, American institutions will prevail. And they're so steady, it's like strong ballast in the ship to keep it from rocking so much. But what we really found was that some of those institutions, much like international standards and domestic standards that they're safeguarding, were put in the crosshairs of the Trump administration pretty much from the get-go. And that was true across the board in terms of the targeting of protection mechanisms and any kind of oversight mechanisms that could right the ship in this unstable political moment. And a few of the areas I'd like to go into in greater depth in that regard are the situations of migrants and asylum seekers. Immigration has always been a hot button issue in the US, but I think that we really got to see international standards in relation to reception of asylum seekers and treatment of foreign nationals really come into the fore. And what does that mean for international standards of refugee law, among other standards of non-refoulement. Then also to talk a little bit about the about face on sexual and reproductive health rights and protection of LGBTI rights, and what that means when the US's foreign and domestic policy is engaged on these issues for international protection of those domains of human rights. And then finally also a look at, in light of the dramatic events over the last year, particularly since the police killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis, at some of the issues around freedom of peaceful assembly and social movements that have arisen on all sides of the political spectrum. In the US and also globally. I know in England it's been really quite dramatic as well, and like in the US, one of the biggest civil rights movements ever, but at a minimum since the most pivotal civil rights movements during decolonialization and the 1960s around the world. So it's been really quite a moment to live in, and I imagine a moment to study these issues in. But I'd like to, try to portray a few of those issues with the backdrop of assaults on institution and standards, and then human rights advocacy in this context. And of course, also in the backdrop, right, as we're all aware, is the global pandemic of COVID-19. And this has really, inflected all aspects of doing any kind of work, whether it's studies at university, or human rights work. It has presented methodological challenges as well as challenges for social movements in organizing publicly. There have been some, let's say, silver linings on these very, very dark clouds. For instance, I would say that the dangerous and human rights abusing administration of President Trump would very possibly still be in power had not the pandemic torpedoed the economy and dramatically changed American and global life in so many ways across the board, and really provided this amazing moment for the Trump administration to show its complete incompetence and malice in many regards, that really undermined what looked like a clear path to re-election, which could have opened up another much more dangerous chapter of attacks on institutions and standards. So, one other offshoot to get more into the substantive discussion of the COVID-19 pandemic was that it also postponed operations in Geneva, including of the Human Rights Council. And the US was actually up for its Universal Periodic Review this year. And I think this is an interesting way to get into those international standards and then zoom in on some of the articulations of that in domestic US life. But the Universal Periodic Review of the US was supposed to be held last May. And due to the shutdown of all normal life in light of the pandemic, it was pushed back to November. In fact, a few days after the US general elections. And we were put in this interesting position where the former administration of President Trump had done all of the legwork in submitting the state report and all of this, which was really quite a calcification of many of the attacks that the administration had waged on human rights standards at home and abroad. And then following the elections was the review of the US performance. And then over the months that followed, the subsequent administration then got to review the state response to the outcome of the working group of the UPR when it was accepting which recommendations it wanted to, right? And indicating which recommendations of the Human Rights Council and the Universal Periodic Review it supported and which it did not. And so we got to see firsthand how the State Department's legal unit under the new leadership of President Biden then actually went back and rewrote the draft report in relation to Universal Periodic Review recommendations. And there was some interesting contours to this, actually much more interesting than you would think for a UPR, in that out of the 347 recommendations that were made to the US last November, the US accepted, the US government and Amnesty International have different counts on the number that it accepted, but let's say about 75–80% of them, which is great. It's not bad at all, including combating discrimination of all kinds in light of the Black Lives Matter movement, among other movements, ending violence against women and girls, combating gun violence. We've seen, in the US right now, already it's mass shooting season, not to put it blithely. Now that some of the lockdowns are loosening and you get to see mental illness and ready access to guns and among other issues, all in this perfect storm of unregulated violence. Then protecting the right to freedom of peaceful assembly, which we've seen has been a major issue over the last 1 or more years. Excessive use of force by police. All of these were areas where the US, in principle, accepted the recommendations of the UPR. Where other circumstances, they offered less support or ambiguous support. And this is one of the areas that I think that you get to see this juncture of the Trump and Biden administrations and how, in some ways, they're taking very different approaches to human rights, and in other ways, they're taking very different approaches to human rights rhetoric, right? For instance, in the situation in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, which is now, next year, it will be 20 years since this facility opened for detention purposes in the so-called global war on terror. And the US, in principle, now, under the Biden administration, supports the recommendations to close it, but says at the same time that will be something that will be reviewed and done let's say, in line with US values but in the meantime, it will continue to detain people. So it's okay. So that's sort of a support for that recommendation, but not entirely, right? And likewise, in relation to the sanctions that were imposed by the Trump administration, rather dramatically and outrageously against ICC prosecutorial officials, asset freezes, visa bans, etc. The Trump administration indicated that it supports the recommendation in principle to lift them, but will have to review it, right? And decried some of the ICC's approach and discussions of human rights violations in Israel, right? And so here we have some interesting dynamics, and with the U.S. government having just written to Amnesty International, slightly complaining or critiquing that we'd said they didn't seem to actually support the recommendations to immediately close Guantanamo and to immediately lift the sanctions on ICC officials, among others. And there's an interesting kind of preface that I think says a lot about the situation or the approach of the U.S. to human rights obligations in its response to the UPR outcome, where it says, hey, sometimes we're offering our support for recommendations, but that may just be because we support the ideal. We support this idealistic idea of closing Guantanamo, which we may never actually do, right? And they put it actually quite clearly, which is respectful, I guess, to their audience, but at the same time says a lot in terms of the poor performance that the U.S. has on implementation of human rights obligations at home and extraterritorially, while the Biden administration is really trying to get back on the right page in terms of its having a seat at the table and in terms of using human rights rhetoric to advance its foreign policy interests, especially in a more effective way, while perhaps as an upshot of that, to also implement some of these where feasible in the U.S. And in line with their political platform. But so I think that's an interesting kind of international starting point, the UPR, right? To drill down and say, okay, so the rhetoric has shifted, but what's going to shift in reality? There were some things that changed immediately upon the transition of the administration 2 months ago, right? Actually, almost exactly 2 months ago, especially in terms of international engagement, not only there at the Human Rights Council, where the Trump administration had dramatically abandoned its elected seat on the Human Rights Council in a couple of years ago, and now the Biden administration has restored its seat in an observer status and is going to seek re-election to the Human Rights Council. It immediately rejoined the Paris Climate Accord, which of course has a huge human rights impact across the board, since, as everyone knows, climate change issues and related issues that are impacted by climate change will be really defining a lot of the global issues that we're looking at moving ahead, whether that's situations of people on the move or otherwise. The rescinding of the denunciation of the World Health Organization Constitution, that was quite an interesting one and relevant to the U.S., especially because as my professor of economic, social, and cultural rights at Essex, Paul Hunt, has really shown the world through his own work with the World Health Organization. That is a treaty-based organization that provides the right to health, which is something missing in the U.S. context, since the U.S. is one of the countries that has not ratified the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. So providing the right to health may not mean much in terms of the U.S.'s sense of its own legal obligations, but it certainly, as we've seen in terms of the dramatic political posturing of the Trump administration when it indicated its desire to quit the WHO, it does have a lot to do with international cooperation in relation to this, to distribution of vaccines or other essential activities to achieve the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health, right? Both being implicated in COVID-19. Interestingly, the WHO Constitution, as a treaty, does not have a denunciation clause. So the U.S. had actually issued a reservation upon joining the WHO rather dramatically. I mean, it's kind of weird, but it had created a path to exit the WHO in the future if it so chose, which apparently the Trump administration picked up on because they activated it. But there was a year lag time between the denunciation and the entry in force of that denunciation. And so the Biden administration was able to correct course and rescind that denunciation and stay party to the WHO treaty and on board with that. The ICC personnel issue, though, is still a glaring omission in that regard, and we're hoping that they resolve that as soon as possible. But these are some of the areas in terms of the engagement of international institutions that we've seen some about faces. Others, they're a little bit more ambiguous. For instance, the Trump administration actually sent a letter to Amnesty International in response to a statement we made before the Human Rights Council, which was actually really quite interesting, in which they indicated, for instance, that special procedures of the Human Rights Council, they were not going to collaborate or cooperate with at all. Because we were pointing out that the US was one of several countries that had not been responding to country visit requests, that had not been engaging special procedures of the Human Rights Council in relation to their reporting. The Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights had come to the US in 2017, actually, and that was really the last report that was issued. I don't think that the Trump administration, especially with their white nationalist discriminatory tendencies and viewpoints, appreciated the focus on disproportionate discrimination against communities of color in the U.S., lack of access to potable water, and other pretty embarrassing aspects. So that was really one of the last engagements with special procedures, following which they made clear they would only engage special procedures when it was in the U.S.'s foreign policy interest. And, you know, in some senses it's outrageous, and in other senses it's just saying the quiet thing aloud, which the U.S. government has probably done in some senses, as many governments have in the past, that they, you know, hence why every country in the world, except the U.S., is a party to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, because it's an easy step, right? That you get you a seat at the table, but with minimal forfeiting of sovereignty or other national prerogatives. And I think to some extent, special procedures are similar, because it can be embarrassing to reject their presence. But nonetheless, in this latest UPR of the U.S., we've seen not dissimilar approach to the special procedures, where they said, yeah, we'd be welcoming to the special rapporteur on torture or other mandate holders, provided that we agree to certain terms and conditions, which are not specified in the response, right? So, okay, we're still getting the sense that there might be some hesitancy, but at least there's it's more possible to name and shame this administration from a practitioner's point of view than such a shameless administration as the one we saw go out previously. So, you know, those said, I think that the World Health Organization denunciation was really kind of emblematic of this spastic lashing out of the past administration whenever it faced any kind of criticism, right? And it was also a good demonstration of the really quite abysmal handling of the COVID-19 crisis, from the initial denial of the crisis at all and saying it was going to disappear magically in a few months, to creating really dramatic identity politics around mask wearing, which you still see, where it's really it's like a political flag whether or not you wear a face mask in the U.S. when it should be a pretty basic public health measure that everyone's on board with. But that was like one of the more, let's say, trivial political expressions of the bad handling of the crisis. And then I think more dramatically, you see the incredibly different discriminatory health outcomes of communities based on their social situation, their economic social situation, and with communities of color and incarcerated populations particularly hard hit, where you start to see more of the engagement with state responsibility, especially for those who are in U.S. custody, whether in U.S. immigration detention or in federal penitentiaries, where, as I'm sure all of you students of international law know, it's all on the country in whose custody these people are to uphold their human rights to life, health, etc. So, with the U.S. really leading in deaths nationally in total, and I'd actually have to check the stats again, but at least previously per capita, it's been a pretty disgraceful handling of the COVID-19 crisis in general. And as Lars was hinting at in his introduction, I think that we've seen, like any kind of crisis management during the Trump administration, many of these crises created by the Trump administration, they've leveraged this to do maximum damage to vulnerable communities. And one of the most, I would say, obscene articulations of this that's still somewhat under the radar, both domestically in the U.S. and globally, is how they leverage this to really magnify their assaults on migrants and asylum seekers at the southwest U.S.-Mexico border, land border, which was building upon years, ever since 2017, of assaults against these vulnerable individuals. And namely, last March, actually, 1 year ago today, I believe, exactly on the dot, the 24th of March of 2020, the Trump administration bullied the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, our main public health institution, into adopting an order under what we call Title 42 of the U.S. Code, which basically allows restrictions on travel for public health purposes. And this was actually not just in response to the COVID-19 crisis. This had been actually something that the architect of the Trump administration's most abusive policies and programs attacking the rights of migrants and asylum seekers had been seeking to do since he arrived, which was to frame migrants and asylum seekers under this public health lens as diseased and transmitting, dangerous diseases, etc. And they tried to invoke it before, but there was absolutely no basis. So this was, they saw the opportunity to bring this discriminatory white nationalist mindset and ethos and rhetoric into the response to COVID-19, and to effectually close the entire southwest border, not only to tourists, but also to migrants and asylum seekers. And this, of course, flouts not only international standards on non-refoulement and refugee protection, which the U.S. is bound by. It recognizes it is bound by through state practice, including in its recitals of its international obligations, its periodic recitals of what it recognizes as customary international law, including non-refoulement. But nonetheless, flying in the face of the standards it recognizes it has under national and international law, under UNCAT, under the Refugee Convention, or its protocol there too, anyway, in the case of the U.S. It shut the border entirely on for migrants and asylum seekers. And what's happened is, over the last now exactly 1 year since they adopted this dramatic measure and ordered the border closed to refugees, the U.S. has summarily expelled, is the term it uses, expulsions, without any access to asylum procedures, over 500,000 migrants and asylum seekers at the U.S.-Mexico land border, including through November, at least 13,000 unaccompanied kids, which is now back in the fore with the border drama at the moment. But so these people were not given any access to legal counsel, to typical screenings of risk of death or serious human rights violations that these people could face upon expulsion to their countries of origin, or to Mexico. In some cases, Mexico is accepting some people back. What's resulted is basically an entrenchment of all of the previous policies that the Trump administration had adopted on the border, which was sort of like, it's like in terms of a practitioner's perspective, I'm not sure if you have the same terminology, but it's like whack-a-mole. It's like basically different things keep on popping up and you're trying to beat them down one after the other, but by the time you're actually getting to court hearings on one illegal policy, one or two more have already been erected. And this was the latest in a series of attacks on the rights of migrants and asylum seekers in particular, as well as practitioners supporting them, by the way. We can talk a little bit about human rights defenders in a minute. But this started with a gradual pushing of the goalposts back for migrants and asylum seekers seeking to exercise their right to seek and enjoy asylum in the U.S. And it started with something where they, called the metering policy, where they said basically, oh, you know, as early as this had been happening periodically when ports of entry were already at capacity in certain surges of arrivals of migrants and asylum seekers, that they would make people wait in Mexico for some unspecified amount of time until they felt they had the capacity or the desire and prioritization to process migrants and asylum seekers at the border. And the Trump administration took this occasional practice and turned it into a border-wide policy where they forced migrants and asylum seekers to wait in Mexico and sign up on illegal asylum wait lists that ballooned into tens of thousands of people waiting in northern Mexico in incredibly dangerous border cities that are like cauldrons of violence over which Mexican authorities don't have complete control, where criminal cartels and transnational criminal organizations and law enforcement authorities in some places are almost indifferentiable. So this is in places that the U.S. has travel warnings and advises against anyone going to because of how dangerous they are, is where they were trying to force refugees to wait. And this was also then connected to what became a global scandal that I think everyone has seen, which was the family separations policy. Because what they sought to do was, because such a large number of the refugees arriving at the U.S.-Mexico border were in family units, they were seeking to force families back into these dangerous places to then make them cross irregularly into the U.S., which, contrary to international refugee law, is a criminal offense in the United States to cross irregularly, even for the purpose of seeking asylum. And so then, whereas normally for asylum claims they wouldn't prosecute these people, they created this mandatory zero tolerance policy, as they called it, and started forcibly separating families under the auspices of these prosecutions, even though they weren't actually ultimately pressing charges against all of the individuals who crossed. And as people saw, this resulted in the separation of thousands of families without any plan to identify the kids and keep the families together, or reunite them at a later stage, which, you know, speaks volumes to the way in which the past administration really sought to do maximum damage to the rights of rights holders, and in a fashion that was willy-nilly and didn't even have the goal of ultimately remedying these people's situations. It was meant as an absolute deterrent to asylum-seeking families to cause such immense suffering and pain that they would either give up their asylum claims in the U.S. Or would never come in to begin with. And it's for this reason that actually, in a report that that we issued, Amnesty International issued in 2018, we established and found that that this policy in many cases rose to the level of torture, because it was a deliberate policy impacting large groups of people that was conducted by the state for the purpose of causing incalculable harm and suffering, and in order to achieve a specific objective, in this case, to deter people from coming or to make them give up their claims for protection if they did come. And in court hearings that I attended, you know, you'd even see immigration judges who are not independent, who work for the Department of Justice and the executive branch in the USA, who were pressuring separated parents and guardians to give up their asylum cases for the purpose of being reunited with their family members and being sent back to their country of origin. And you can't find a more clear instrumentalization of this unlawful practice to leverage the harm of people that really caused, in the woman whose case I'm thinking of, who was a grandmother who had legal guardianship over her mentally disabled child or grandchild. She had heart conditions, mental issues, all of the hallmarks of someone who's experienced torture. And it was for this reason, such grave health outcomes for people, both physical and mental, as a response to this policy, that we also engaged in some individual cases, and we're proud that former Special Rapporteur on Torture, another coup in inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment, Juan Mendez, had joined on to an amicus brief we worked on with the Global Justice Center at NYU. on one of these cases, and subsequently Physicians for Human Rights just last year issued a report which also did a longer-term look at the health outcomes of what they also found rose to the levels of torture in reality and under international law, which cited back to our report in this regard. But at the same time, this was the kind of area where you could see opportunities for, if not accountability, because I don't think there's anyone issuing arrest warrants for the architects of this torturous campaign, like for black sites of the Bush administration or conduct of Henry Kissinger, et cetera, at least for some sort of administrative or legal remedies. There have been class action lawsuits filed against all these policies over the years, and we've seen, for instance, as a response to our reporting, which found that thousands more families were actually separated by the government than had ever been admitted to, the Office of Inspector General of one of the departments that was responsible for this then also confirmed our findings and expanded a class action lawsuit to help reunify those families. So this is just kind of an example. But so now under the Biden administration, after years of these unlawful policies of externalization of refugee protection requirements, the Biden administration has still not listed this unlawful order under Title 42 to force away all migrants and asylum seekers during the COVID-19 pandemic, and except for children, for unaccompanied children. So now you're seeing families willfully separating from their children. It's such an impossible decision that no one would ever want to make. But in order to get their kids to safety, 80% of whom have family members who are already in the U.S. This is not random people coming to the U.S., right? These are all people with, or four out of five are people with family connections in the U.S. already who are trying to reunify with families, and hence why they've come here to seek asylum to begin with. But so, these immigration and asylum policy issues have been one of the most dramatic cases of human rights violations in the U.S., but of course not the only ones. I think over the last year in particular, we've really been able to see a dramatic escalation in the xenophobic and white nationalist rhetoric and discriminatory policies of the Trump administration, particularly its egregious responses to the movement for Black Lives, which has existed for many years in the U.S. in response to unlawful discriminatory killings of Black and Brown community members by law enforcement in particular. But since the police killing of George Floyd last May, this has really exponentially increased the breadth and inclusion nationwide of all communities acting in solidarity and in alliance to try to address and remedy this not only police killings against Black and Brown people, but also entrenched institutional discrimination in all walks of life, including, as we've seen, COVID-19 and health outcomes, in environmental racism, in school, in economic opportunity, et cetera. And many of the direct responses we saw from the Trump administration, though, were really pouring fuel on the fire. And we saw these in the middle of a global pandemic, people who were already disproportionately impacted by the COVID-19 crisis going out into the streets in hundreds of thousands to demand their rights and exercise their right to freedom of peaceful assembly. And the police response was brutal. It was excessive use of force from coast to coast across the U.S. And working with other experts from Amnesty International who specialize in looking at weapons, both lethal and less lethal weapons that are used in crowd control contexts. We were able to do some remote monitoring techniques, for instance, to show the scale of the misuse of less lethal weapons in order to target and attack not only people peacefully protesting, for the most part, in 95% of cases, peaceful protests, in the thousands of protests that occurred throughout the U.S. over recent months, but also targeting journalists and other human rights defenders, street medics, legal observers, et cetera. So it was really quite dramatic. And likewise, the Trump administration upped the ante on its racist and xenophobic rhetoric and sought to take this moment, only about a month after the police killing of George Floyd, to launch what it called its 1776 Commission, which is the Revolutionary War of the U.S., the date of the Revolutionary War of the U.S., where it brought together these kind of non-academics with no real background in public history to rewrite the history of the U.S. from, in a very kind of dead white man perspective, to counter particularly the 1619 Project of the New York Times, which had looked back at the roots in slavery and other institutional racism of much of the economic and political institutions of the U.S. That sprang, into a new chapter in 1776. And so to counter these narratives that look back at the checkered history of the U.S. in terms of equality, the Trump administration sought to basically launch a new campaign, which we would have been seeing now in the second term of the Trump administration, of so-called patriotic education. And this was launched on the day before Independence Day, on the 3rd of July of last year, in front of Mount Rushmore, which is like this sacred land of indigenous peoples in the U.S., where they've carved the giant faces of white presidents on the white male presidents on the mountain behind. So it was really this dramatic showcase of white supremacist pushback against this movement for Black lives, which was also a point of departure for a lot of the white nationalist counter-protests against the Black Lives Matter movement, which then merged into anti-mask protests as part of these identity politics, and then ultimately this series of baseless white nationalism infused political protests that they put under the banner of Stop the Steal, that were protesting these baseless claims of election fraud over the last several months, that culminated in that global spectacle of the insurrection at the U.S. Capitol in Washington, D.C. And so point being, none of this was out of nowhere, and it ties together the xenophobia and discriminatory dismantling of the immigration and asylum systems with the rejection of calls for institutional equality domestically as well. And now we're in this kind of aftermath where the Department of Justice is filing charges against hundreds of people across the U.S. for their participation in the insurgency at the U.S. Capitol, but also the new Attorney General, who's Obama's appointee who never got heard for the Supreme Court, Merrick Garland, who's just been confirmed, is now also trying to take on the task of how to handle white nationalist domestic terrorism in the U.S., which has for years been the greatest threat to violence and other, and terrorism that the Department of Homeland Security of the United States has identified in its annual threat assessments. So we've seen the hypocrisy in the treatment of protests. I can go into a greater depth if that's of interest in how the police handled that insurgency at the Capitol versus the Black Lives Matter protests, and the hypocrisy related to the when Trump was trying to impose mandatory minimums of 10 years in jail for for vandalizing statues, and then we see thousands of his supporters attacking the actual seat of government, etc. But basically now we're in this aftermath, and what happens now as you see like these threats against freedom of peaceful assembly, where now on the state level, being in a federal system, there are lots of state bills now being pushed into place to further restrict freedom of peaceful assembly, to restrict sexual health and reproductive rights. Now that there's a more liberal government in place that's trying to roll back some of the dangerous restrictions on those, for instance, the global gag rule, as they call it, which prohibited U.S. funding to any organizations around the world that would facilitate people's reproductive and sexual health rights. The situations of voting rights, there's now state-level bills, hundreds of them all over the country, that are trying to make it harder to vote after seeing a lot of increased voting. It's been one of the greatest turnouts in U.S. history for voters, despite the pandemic, despite the violence at the polls, despite calls of President Trump for white nationalist militia groups to stand by in the context of the elections, and then the attacks on the U.S. institutions following the elections, et cetera. So we're seeing a moment where there's a lot of tension between the federal system and what the U.S. is saying at the national and international levels and what's happening at the federal level. We're also seeing this also with situations like the death penalty, right? Where the U.S. is a retentionist state with the death penalty, one of the few in its UN geographic bloc. When I used to work at the OSCE, and it was always dramatic to recognize that the only two true retentionist states were the U.S. and Belarus, which is interesting because you had a way to get these governments to the table to talk about something. But nonetheless, in the context of the UPR, the Biden administration indicated that while it supports the abolition of the death penalty, they really kicked the can to Congress and said there has to be a legislative fix, and they didn't even commit to a moratorium on implementation of the federal death penalty, despite the fact that there had been such a moratorium in place until the Trump administration for 17 years. And the Trump administration actually carried out 13 executions in the last 6 months of its term, beginning on the 14th of July and ending just 4 days before Biden's inauguration on the 20th of January. And they were actually the first federal executions in 17 years, and more than had been conducted under the federal death penalty than in the previous 56 years combined. So, it's pretty alarming that the Biden administration hasn't committed to roll that back. But nonetheless, we are seeing some positive indications that they're taking important steps, at least at the international level, to recommit to human rights standards, both domestically and in its foreign policy. One that Lars had mentioned previously when we were chatting was the Commission on Unalienable Rights, which was, like the 1776 Commission. It was another kind of bogus advisory commission that was established 2 years ago to re-examine the definition of human rights, basically, and try to unilaterally redefine what human rights are vis-a-vis the U.S.-American national tradition. And hence the name Commission on Unalienable Rights, which it sought to basically establish a hierarchy of human rights and say, some human rights are unalienable, and they derive from God-given Judeo-Christian ideals of, or rights that are integral to the human being, with God as the spiritual and legal center of all obligations of the government towards the individual, right? And chief among those rights and the views of the Trump administration, ultimately in this outcome report, were the right to property and the right to freedom of religion or belief. And clearly in the balancing of rights, the right to property does not trump the right to life, including of people in need of respect for their and protection of their reproductive rights, for instance. And whereas the rights to sexual and reproductive health rights and LGBTI people's rights, the right to non-discrimination, including through temporary special measures such as affirmative action, were particularly singled out by the Trump administration as not being true human rights, but rather as being divisive social controversies, which were not actual rights. And they kind of bunched this in with ESCR and shorthand and dismissing them entirely, right? And so it was great to see that the Biden administration, including through Secretary of State Blinken, who was recently confirmed, have agreed basically to shred this document. Good riddance to bad rubbish, though unfortunately the administrative lawsuit against the commission and this report, finding that they had violated all sorts of administrative procedures and the whole thing was invalid and should be scrapped and made moot, was thrown out as moot. And so we're already seeing efforts by former Trump officials to keep this thing alive for whenever they get next into power, in order to try to once again attack the global human rights framework and subordinate it to U.S. national law and tradition, which of course runs contrary to the international treaty law, including under the Vienna Convention on Law of Treaties, which the U.S. hasn't ratified, by the way. It's still in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee after 40 some odd years, but it's all for the most part customary anyway, right? So they recognize they can't ignore the treaty obligations, but they still try. So, you know, what happens next? What's the outlook moving forward? I'll try to wrap it up here pretty quickly. Basically, I think that one of the things we really saw across the board during the Trump administration was more than assault on the rights of vulnerable individuals, an assault on truth, right? And the rhetorical devices used by the President Trump's administration over the last 4 years to wage these campaigns of human rights violations against some of the most vulnerable people in society, and to try to roll back the clock on U.S. state practice in recognizing human rights of LGBTI people, women, ethnic minorities, among others, were not only seated in white nationalism, that certainly they were, but it was also seated in this and efforts to completely destroy truth and make all investigative journalism or human rights reporting by organizations such as ours irrelevant against sets of, as they called them, alternative facts was one term used by a former spokesperson of President Trump, to make it so you can't hold an intelligent conversation with the same factual framework to actually counter some of these narratives. So in the context of immigration, we'd see this when there were a series of quote unquote caravans of migrants and asylum seekers who were traveling in groups for safety, which started off just a few dozen, and in part from the heckling of the Trump administration, grew into movements of thousands of people traveling together to seek safe haven in the US, which, you know, the Trump administration would frame this as the left of the political establishment, the Democratic Party, are trying to bring thousands of migrants to the US to vote in US midterms, right, illegally. And just these kind of baseless, wild claims, or the people who were migrant human rights defenders on the border, they would frame as traffickers and criminals, and were criminally investigating US lawyers who were traveling to Mexico to try to legally represent all these people who were being unlawfully pushed away at US borders. In terms of freedom of expression and the movement for Black lives, you'd often see these same words be co-opted by the Trump administration to talk about racist and xenophobic hate speech. And it would all be embraced as, oh, freedom of expression. So they'd co-opt the language of rights, right? Or like fake news, as you may recall from the 2016 US elections, when there were all of these troll factories in Eastern Europe and the Balkans that were creating these fake news stories that really became such an issue as they're being disseminated by bots to cause social strife and undermine democratic processes. The UN was involved, OSCE was involved, trying to say, how do we counter this new era of fake news? The Trump administration then co-opted those terms and said, fake news is anything that criticizes us. And one thing I'll always remember from when we issued a report on, including finding that the Trump administration had separated thousands more families than it had initially admitted during 2018, a spokesperson for the US Department of Homeland Security said, that's fake news. That whole report is lies from Amnesty International. And a journalist whom they'd said this to said, okay, well, which part is lies? And they said, oh, we haven't read the report. Could you send us a copy? You know, it didn't matter. It was just, you disregard everything as lies, or you pervert terms and flip the meaning of them, et cetera. And so now, you know, we saw the culmination of this kind of assault on the truth in the January 6th insurrection at the U.S. Capitol, where after, you know, this was not the first thing, just days after the U.S. elections, which were, you know, free and fair, however troubling in many regards, in terms of the rhetoric used and a lot of the lead up to them and the violence between protests and counter protests. Nonetheless, you know, I met here with the OSCE election monitoring mission who comes every year since 2000, since past election debacles in the U.S. They found a lot of problems with the U.S. elections, but ultimately not any major fraud. And likewise, none of the dozens of lawsuits waged by the Trump administration against the outcome of the election produced anything but rejections, saying that for the most part, the elections were untainted by widespread fraud. And yet, days afterward was the first of several big protests led by the Trump administration and its acolytes and proxies in the far-right news media and far-right social movements, in white nationalist militia groups, to foment instability. And they came in November, they came in December, and then they came again in January at President Trump's beckoning. And he kind of like loaded the gun, shot it at the Capitol, and everyone saw what happened. I mean, it was like this massive insurrection that was met with minimum law enforcement resistance. Investigations are pending. But this was really the culmination of years of assault on truth. And now we have this incredible project of trying to rebuild the public discourse, which has been more polarized than ever, and journalistic practice is, it's been in a different headspace during the Trump administration, and now it's having to readapt to a new climate, though still mixed with massive, widespread disinformation and conspiracy theories in social media, among other outlets. But it's all not dark and bleak. Looking forward, we're seeing not only conservative governments at the state level try to shred voter rights and right to freedom and peaceful assembly, but also some hopeful signs of reinvigorated discussions about human rights in the U.S., both in relation to ending police violence, health equities, which itself has become a big conflict in terms of equity versus equality, and the political right in the U.S. gets really upset about terms of equity, and would basically says, you'll never be satisfied. First legal equality, and now equality in outcomes. What? But so the point that we're having these discussions about non-discrimination, but directly and indirectly in terms of outcomes, is really vital. This is something that President Obama had included in the USA's first UPR in 2008-9, and had been met with right-wing rebukes in opinion pieces and in major media outlets, saying basically if people have a higher prevalence of cancer, you can't call that discrimination. That's just biology or something like this, right? So it's great to see we're at a point at least where, amidst this global pandemic, health outcomes and inequities are actually being seen as a discrimination issue, seen as an institutional discrimination issue. We're having serious hearings about reparations in the US, not for all of those migrants and asylum seekers who have been discriminated against over the last few years and had their rights horribly flouted in summary expulsions up to more than 500,000 people, but more looking further back in terms of racial inequities and how to address that meaningfully. So, we're seeing some steps of progress, and even a few weeks ago, there was a legislative bill passed in the state of Virginia, just across the Potomac River from where I am, that was recognizing the human right to water, and even some, what we would call minimum core content of it, though of course they don't put it in those terms. So, there's some hopeful signs as well, and I realize I've been blathering on for some time, so I'll turn it back to Lars, and would love to hear, Lars, your immediate feedback or anything you'd like me to dig deeper into before we open it up to questions from others. But thanks so much for this opportunity to give you a little bit of a portrait. And I do have some photos and stuff that I could go through if we have time, either now or after questions. I don't know what you would prefer. To look a little bit at some of the ways that we've done human rights monitoring in the US in some of these circumstances, to give a more human face of these issues we've been discussing.
Thanks very much, Brian. Yeah, if you could maybe go through the photos, that would be great. And I guess sort of kicking that off, one of I have a number of questions, and I would invite, we're starting to have questions come in to the Q&A, and I'd invite other people to type in questions. But I guess one question I have for you is you started off by talking about the UPR report, and Amnesty. For those who haven't read it, Amnesty's UPR shadow report for the US is very strong, very hard hitting. But how did you prioritize? There were so many human rights issues that you could have tackled there. How did you pick and choose the ones you focused on? And how did you prioritize them within that report? And that also kind of leads into a second question that I can get to about, sort of your first report of this year, big report of this year, was on Guantanamo. And so again, why if you can, as somebody who's working within Amnesty, and how do you make those hard choices about what to prioritize when there are so many issues that are crying out?
Great question. And I should, thanks for asking both those together, because they're the same answer, which is that I would say, to go first question first, the UPR is a reflection not only of critical thematic issues related to human rights respect and protection in the US and by the US extraterritorially, through its foreign policy or otherwise, but also it's a summation of the key concerns that we've already addressed in our thematic and geographical reporting on the US. And so how do we go about prioritizing? It really depends from thing to thing. You have your kind of long-term, medium-term, short-term, right? You've got your reactive short-term stuff that's like slightly shiny object, right? But something that's really critical. You want to offer that human rights lens to it. It may be something that you immediately respond to, but has long-standing ramifications. So you'll, some of those issues are included in that report, and that, whether it's regard to support for unlawful military operations abroad, or it's other dramatic issues, lack of respect for peaceful assemblies. But then actually I have copies of a few reports just in case I needed props. But so for this one, for instance, which is a 2018 report, you don't have any rights here, that looks at illegal pushbacks, ill treatment of asylum seekers, including but not limited to family separations, and indefinite arbitrary detention of asylum seekers, for instance. Those were some of several issues that we drilled in on, or zoomed in on, based on wide consultations with partners. Because organizations such as Amnesty, we're a global campaign organization. We're not always the people who are going to be the frontline workers on said issue for years before and after, right? And our focus might shift in response to global events or to strategic advocacy opportunities. But there are lots of primary caregivers, legal professionals who are down to the dishes every day. And so a lot of times we want to work with our coalition partners and uplift their work, uplift the voices of rights holders, and be really strategic. And where could our membership mobilization of millions of Amnesty members and our high profile on some of these issues put some wind in the sails of other people. And so things like family separations, before that hit international news headlines, we'd been working on it for about 6 months, because it was something we were able to kind of get our early preliminary radar on, our early warning on, and had already built up a body of interviews and cases that we were working on in relation to that, so that when it hit the headlines, we were able to come out strong. We'd already identified that this gross level of torture in practice. So that's one way, right? Other cases, for instance, here's a report that we issued last year in the COVID context. We are adrift about to sink the looming COVID-19 disaster in U.S. immigration detention facilities, with a map of all the different U.S., over 200 different immigration detention facilities in the U.S. This was more reactive, right? It was saying we already knew immigration detention was a horrible problem in the U.S. But here you've got a tinderbox. It's about to go up in flames with COVID, which happened after the report came out. So this was like a preliminary, here's what you have to do to prevent this from happening. And of course, the government did the opposite. But in other cases, my phone just started blowing up with migrant human rights defenders who were getting stopped and searched at the border, detained. People were getting prosecuted for human smuggling, for supporting migrants, or investigated for human trafficking, et cetera. So that was something where the interviews started happening, and then it led to a fuller investigation. And then a disgruntled employee leaked information about the investigation to the media, and we were able to get these inside documents, et cetera, which then we produced this report, Saving Lives is Not a Crime, Politically Motivated Legal Harassment Against Migrant Human Rights Defenders by the US. So that was, again, reactive. And then something more planned, which we'd actually already been planning since 2019, but we said, okay, Freedom of Peaceful Assembly, it's going to be a big problem in the US. And we know this going into the elections, so we were already working on it. And then everything blew up, the movement for Black Lives, and the confluence of that with political protests, et cetera. And so we ended up also kind of foreseeing that these, I don't know if you can see the cover here, but you see like a heavily armed, militia member counter-protester was facing off with some Black Lives Matter protesters. And it was clear that the clashes between protesters and counter-protesters were really spiraling out of control, and that law enforcement authorities at the local, county, state, and federal levels were not protecting the rights of protesters at all. So sometimes it's reactive, sometimes it's planned reactive, like with Freedom of Peaceful Assembly, and other times it's long-term, saying, we want to actually bring these issues into the fore where they might not already be in the discussion.
Great, thank you very much. It's just helpful, I think, for folks who kind of want to know how Amnesty makes the choices it does, and certainly for some of our students trying to understand kind of how human rights practice works. I guess one other question that I'll ask you, and then I'll turn to some of the questions in the chat, is I think in February we had Hina Shamsi, who's the director of the ACLU's National Security Project, come and speak at one of these Human Rights Center webinars. And she was very critical of the Obama-Biden presidency and pointed to ways that some of their actions, you can think targeted assassinations, for example, drone strikes, where that sort of paved the way for some furthering of the Trump administration's human rights violations. And so, again, thinking of that and then turning back to Guantanamo, which you brought up and was, sort of the big report from January that Amnesty put out, how hopeful are you that the Biden administration is going to do any better than the Obama administration at closing it down, right? I mean, we had this rather premature promise from Obama in his presidency, and you pointed out in your talk that, President Biden is a little reluctant now, though in your January report, of course, you call him out and say, hey, remember in 2009, you promised you were going to close this. This is now 2021. How hopeful are you that that's going to really happen?
Thanks for asking that. And sorry, I missed that before. That was actually a really excellent report written by a colleague of mine, Rob Freer, who is based in London, actually. And recommend checking that out to anybody who hasn't already. It's a good update on the situation in Guantanamo. Indeed, I mean, how else to put it? The Obama administration pledged on day one to immediately close Guantanamo, which now you can see why the Biden administration is so reluctant to do, because it didn't work out for the Obama administration. They did try, but then they got a lot of congressional roadblocks. Nobody was going to allow them to bring detainees back into the U.S. territorially, including to then prosecute folks through the normal justice system. So we have this flagrant abandoning of international standards in terms of right to a fair trial, unlawful detentions for indefinitely, et cetera. And how does the Biden administration deal with this? Well, there are probably some solutions if they really wanted to get creative. I don't know if any of them would be attractive, but whether that is from flouting Congress and just bringing people back to U.S. territory, whether it's bringing people on boats to harbors, I have no idea. I mean, I don't know exactly what the mechanics of it are. I don't know what their contingencies are, but it's where there's a will, there's a way. And I think that what we've mostly seen is lack of political will, including as enunciated in the U.S. response to those UPR recommendations, that it supports in principle the idea of not having lawless detention facilities outside of U.S. law, but they might never ever close it. Was sort of the response, right? And they'll see, and in the interim, they'll continue exactly as it is now. So that's not really uplifting. Shoot for the stars a little bit, right? And so I don't know quite what we're going to see come out of them, but I don't think it's a priority for them, unfortunately, because it isn't a burning U.S. priority. We're not seeing outcry at the U.S. level. It's slightly forgotten. People have other concerns. So I don't think that their constituencies are holding their feet to the fire, and I don't think they want to spend their political capital on this. And so I'm not that hopeful, but I hope they prove me wrong, I suppose.
No, thanks. And again, what you're saying, it's sort of what I suspect as well, but also made me think, it was gutsy of Amnesty to say, okay, you're coming into office, this is the first thing we want to confront you with. And again, I agree. For other people, it's a really great report, particularly because it's not just about the history of Guantanamo and the need to close it, but also it's a real call for accountability and remedy for those who've been through it. And again, feeds into some of the discussions that have been going on. Again, not very likely that there may be some sort of transitional justice mechanism for so many of the human rights abuses committed during the Trump administration. But let me
actually, sorry, let me jump back and respond to the other aspect of your questions I didn't fully, which is sort of like, where were there other issues where the Obama administration was not great, and how did that then get articulated in some of the horrendous abuses we saw in the Trump administration? Well, drone strikes is one of them, right? I would say that actually Obama was much more engaged in this global campaign of drone killings of thousands of people around the world, on and off of conventional battlefields. And it really put a stake in the heart of some international humanitarian law obligations, right? And some of the Obama policies, like quote unquote signature strikes, where somebody's carrying a mobile phone that's associated or affiliated somehow with a terrorist in the view of the US, then everyone around that person is basically materially supporting terrorists and can be an adequate justification for lethal strikes that throw out the rule book on what would typically be the approach of the US Department of Defense, where they have to calculate the number of civilian casualties from any given strike to determine whether or not it would be lawful and proportionate to a military goal or objective. And so basically the Obama administration said, oh, there's no civilian casualties here because everybody's somehow a terrorist, right? And irrespective of their nationality, direct participation in hostilities, et cetera. So it really unilaterally and unlawfully rewrote the book on US military engagements in a way that's unsustainable as well as illegal. And it's, and basically opened the door to other flagrant abuses, such as the strike against Soleimani in Iraq, which is, I don't think it was completely unjustified, the trolling tweet of the Iranians thereafter showing a drone shadow over Trump on the golf course or something like this. I mean, they were just trolling, but fair enough point, right? In terms of the lawlessness of it all. Immigration as well was an area where the Obama administration really was pretty dreadful. He was an ally of the human rights movement in many respects, but was the drone killer in chief and was the deporter in chief. And that's part of his legacy. And, it's an imperfect legacy, but it's an imperfect world. But, a lot of the programs were really brought back to life in a much more malicious way by the Trump administration in terms of the mass deportation machinery in the US, but then they were also expanded. One of the most terrifying things that I think we again would have been seeing in a second term of the Trump administration, and thank goodness we're not seeing now, was Trump had kind of said the silent thing aloud again, and his administration responded sort of shh, like don't say that, when he had indicated in summer of 2019 that they had planned to deport millions of undocumented people from the US. Millions, because I actually haven't looked at the latest stats, but I think there's around 10 million people without documentation in the US, 10 or 12. And many of these people are mixed status families, right? So you're looking at this effort to really say they wanted to engage in a massive immigration enforcement campaign that would divide mixed status families across the country and would be like, while the number of people held in immigration detention in the US was actually going down, they were trying to increase the capacity of US immigration detention facilities up to 60,000 or more people at any time on any day. And this tells you the musculature of the deportation program that they wanted to do, even while the levels of immigration detention were dropping to a quarter of that. So perhaps some of the worst was averted, but definitely on some of these policy programs, the Obama administration set the table for those abuses.
Great, thank you very much. Let me go to some of the questions that have been asked. The first question is appropriately enough from Andrew Fagan, who's the director of the Human Rights Center here at Essex. And his question is, will social activism, such as Black Lives Matter, or judicial action provide the most effective forms of human rights protections in the US? And again, I think probably referring to in your talk, you were talking both about the social movement side of things and the work that Amnesty's done around some of that, but also some of the cases that you've helped bring and all.
Thanks for that. Yeah, the courts in the U.S., I would say, have been overwhelmed and fatigued during the Trump administration. And we've already seen year by year a real change in reception to judicial challenges of some of the unlawful conduct of the U.S. And in that spate of unlawful policies at the border, for instance, that were summarily pushing people away without any access to asylum procedures, with a variety of different legal justifications. I think what we saw was the same as the so-called Muslim ban that the Trump administration began with. And I think it's also a good example of the junction of social movements and legal challenges, where some of the executive orders the Trump administration was promulgating upon coming into power in 2017 were actually they weren't even legal. There's actually an executive order, an issuing executive orders that specifies what you have to do for a lawful executive order that they were flouting. So it was like, I don't know what this is, and nobody really wants to say there's just legal theater happening that has no meaningful status. It's the courts seem a little bit reticent. You're reluctant to go into the depth of the lawlessness of it all, but at the same time there were such problems with the orders and the legal maneuvers that the Trump administration was doing through regulatory or agency rulemaking in lieu of being able to get legislation passed, that one of the main avenues for legal practitioners was to pursue preliminary injunctions and to order halts to implementation of policies. But basically what would happen was you'd get a preliminary injunction and they'd make some minute fixes to the legislation and just basically try to squeeze it through, beat the circle block through the square hole until they could get a court to lift the injunction, or just implement a new policy that's destructive and shift all the attention to that and cause such damage to people that by the time this other case winds its way through legal channels, it's already irrelevant because so much of the damage has been done to the same people, right? So for social movements, though, I think that we saw with the family separation scandal in 2018, where social movements can be more effective than legal challenges in some respects, because this really struck a nerve across political lines and erupted in a kind of social outrage in the US that I would say was unparalleled at other points in the Trump administration until maybe January 6th, but even that was more partisan in nature. And this was bipartisan rejection of this assault on the sanctity of families. So there you actually saw one of the few instances of the Trump administration backpedaling and issuing an executive order and trying to claim responsibility for ending an emergency that they created, right? So I would say that it's really important for the two to work together and to instrumentalize legal challenges as much as possible in tandem with social movements. And they're going to be much more effective that way. If you just have legal challenges happening in the cover of night, I think there's less pressure on authorities. And actually, I don't want to talk about pressure in the judiciary, but I think that when there's a social movement behind something, that the judiciary also stands up to the cause and really takes a deeper look at the values that animate the legal system. And what is law but a cementing of values? Hence why it changes every time, right? Both in the contours of laws that are passed, or repealed, but also in its application by the judiciary, as we've seen in the U.S. Let's say with the constitutional protection of same-sex marriages, the dissenting opinions of which are remarkably familiar to the outcome report of that Commission on Unalienable Rights. These arguments are alive even when you get somewhere. And then when the social movements have won, such as with same-sex marriage, such as with sexual and reproductive health rights to an extent, then you see legal challenges coming from the other side to chisel away those rights. And how do you protect human rights from deaths by 1,000 cuts, right? So, this is where the social movements and legal challenges interplay, and I think it's a really important aspect.
No, thanks a lot. And of course, there's also making the legal challenges harder is changes in composition to the courts, courtesy of the Trump administration and the Senate. Another question that came into the chat was, what three things can human rights and social justice defenders in the U.S. do to promote more effective protection of human rights for persons of color and African Americans?
Sorry, unmute is a struggle. Could you restate the question? I'm sorry, what can practitioners do?
Yeah, so basically what can human rights defenders, social justice practitioners do to do more to protect the human rights of African Americans and persons of color?
Great. Well, I mean, I think that you have some of the immediate struggles and some of the longer term fixes. In many regards, the attention received by the Movement for Black Lives and the expansion of this movement to really be a movement that's animated and touched everyone across the U.S. It was triggered by the death of the police killing of George Floyd last May, but really it's centuries now of racial inequities that have resulted in systemic discrimination in housing, employment, education, environmental racism, health outcomes arising from those, particularly now in the context of COVID-19. I'd say there's a number of avenues. One of the immediate responses right now, which is very much in the fore, is to support legislative and policy fixes to the lack of accountability for racist police violence, right? Which is one of the burning embers right now in terms of harm inflicted on these communities, which is ongoing. And so it's been good to see some movement in that direction, but there's a lot further to go. So in some cases, there's multiple bills right now being presented in Congress to provide legislative fixes for lack of accountability. This is one area where the Obama administration was actually quite good, was getting this Department of Justice to enter into what were called consent agreements with law enforcement jurisdictions where there'd been discriminatory policing and violence, and to get court orders to oversee improvements in those law enforcement agencies' conduct. The Trump administration dropped the support for those, but some of them were court agreements that it couldn't walk out of. Hopefully under Merrick Garland, since this new Attorney General has indicated that challenging white nationalist militia groups and racist law enforcement practice is a priority. Hopefully we'll see some movement in those areas under policy, as well as the passage through Congress of bills that are meant to address these inequities. Longer term, I'm not hopeful that the reparations hearings in the House that happened recently are going to translate into meaningful system-wide action, but hopefully at a minimum, all of the policies of the Trump administration that were challenging affirmative action, bringing lawsuits against universities that were seeking to improve diversity will be all dropped and abandoned. It's hard to tell if that will provide a long-term fix. One of the other major things right now are the conservative efforts to decimate voting rights in a way that runs counter to the Voters' Rights Act that had previously been somewhat gutted or pierced by the Supreme Court of the US. So right now, a major priority of the Biden administration, which is a good thing, is to entrench democratic voting rights protections, particularly for communities of color and others who are systemically targeted by the restrictions on them. And hopefully also some of the discourse that we've seen over the last year will really go much further in centering the voices of affected community members in the full spectrum of human rights where people experience discrimination, which is pretty much across the board in the US. And I think we've actually made a lot of progress in that in the US context. Hopefully globally, it's been great to see how the Human Rights Council, for instance, took up not only racist police violence in the US, but also zoomed out to look at this as an international problem amidst international protests and calls for reforms in these regards. So there's been some progress, but it's only the beginning of a long hike up the hill, right? So there's a lot more work to be done.
Great, thank you very much. I guess we've sort of run out of time already, but I just want to thank you very much for spending the afternoon or your morning with us and taking us through this kind of whirlwind tour of what has been going on in the US for the last 4 years, what we can some of the issues that we should be looking forward to and keeping an eye on, and also sharing some of your insights from your work at Amnesty. I really appreciate that. And again, it's also just personally, it's just great to see an Essex LLM student make good. And boy, you're making good in the real world.
Thanks, Lars. That's very kind. So are we straight up out of time, or anytime looking at a few photos?
Yeah, if you want to just try to show the photos. I don't know if we get cut off, we get cut off. And then I also have just one more question in the Q&A.
I threw a link to some of the photos in an open Google Drive into the chat box there for people to peruse on their own if we run out of time or it gets cut off. But go ahead, Lars.
And then the final question that just came in under the wire is, has the mood music changed under the Biden administration concerning ratifying the International Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights? Does it matter at all on the ground, or would any US administration be happy with simply observing its own human rights norms and values without ratification? But the main question, ICESCR.
I'm not at all hopeful. The Biden administration, during its Universal Periodic Review, indicated its overall support for ratifying the panoply of human rights treaties that it has not ratified. I mean, out of the core human rights treaties, the US has ratified 3, right? And a number of others have remained in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee for decades. Jimmy Carter, after many years of US, let's say, recalcitrance or distance from the human rights framework, in part motivated by racist attitudes counter to the civil rights movement, not wanting African Americans and Black people in the US to go before UN human rights machinery to challenge segregation or other institutionalized racism in the US. For many years, since Eisenhower after World War II until the late 70s, the US did not engage in any of those UN human rights treaties. Jimmy Carter in '78 transmitted several core human rights treaties, including the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, to the Senate for its advice and consent, which it still has not given. So along with several other treaties that the US has signed but not ratified, I'm not hopeful on the ICESCR, however great that would be. The Obama administration had done kind of a workaround during its Universal Periodic Review first submission in 2009, looking at, as previously noted, some of those indirect discrimination issues, including with regard to rights to health or otherwise. It's a little bit passe in 1990s, right, for practitioners to approach ESCR strictly through the lens of discrimination, but better than nothing. So I think that we're more likely to see policies in practice that try to advance economic, social, and cultural rights protections than and a ratification of the ICESCR, which would be too polarizing, I think, for the Biden administration to take on. I don't think it would want to spend political capital on that, and I don't think it would have the votes because it takes 2/3 majority for that sort of stuff. So highly unlikely, but let's keep the candle burning on that one.
And boy, do you guys at Amnesty keep that candle burning, right? I mean, it's like most of your reports are always ratify this, ratify this, ratify that for the US. And, you know, somebody's got to bang on about it. So good on you. I guess Matt told me we have a little time where you can show your photos. That would be great. So I'll let you end with that. But before I turn it over to you for that and to have the last word, it just behooves me to thank my colleagues, Matthew Capes and Katya Al-Khatib, who also made this possible. And of course, Andrew, for inviting you in the first place and cajoling me into hosting. It's been a pleasure. So thanks and everybody who is watching now or in the future. And I'll leave it to you to just show us some photos and close it. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Lars, and Andrew and Katya and Nat for facilitating, and everyone who's joined and chimed in. So I'm going to see if I'm able to effectively share my screen here and see how this goes. Hold on for just a second. Is that working?
No. But
okay, I'm getting the donut of death. Hold on for just a second. I think it's in the works.
Katya says she could do it, but I'll have to, hand off to somebody who's more technically adept than me.
Is this working now? Can you see my screen?
Yeah. So Katya has started screen sharing. Now it's back.
Okay, so you can see my screen?
No, not at the moment. Katya, any help? Yes, now we can see.
Great. Okay. So here's actually the border of the U.S. and Mexico in Tijuana, and you see the Pacific Ocean there with the fence going in. This was actually a peaceful assembly of migrants and asylum seekers as part of this caravan seeking asylum protections in the U.S., whom we went down there at the same time. So in terms of one of the challenges of doing this kind of human rights work, right, is foreseeability. How do you plan on where to be when, and in terms of the situations of migrants and asylum seekers, how do you know when to be there to document illegal turnbacks of migrants and asylum seekers, right? And so in this case, we reached out to some of the coordinators of the caravan and found out approximately when they were going to reach the border and made sure ourselves to be there on the ground when they did arrive. This was not people actually trying to climb over the fence, but it was a public protest, as you can see with the signs, of people who are trying to assert their right to seek asylum at the border, irrespective of the Trump administration's rejection of those rights. This is in May of 2018, or April 2018. And here you can see there's a solidarity protest on the other side here. Can I get full screen? Doesn't seem like it. But there's a solidarity protest on the other side, on the US side, people who are supporting the right to seek asylum. Here you see when the Trump administration immediately closed the doors and rejected all of the people who were seeking asylum, a few hundred people. They erected a tent encampment in the plaza in the port of entry on the Tijuana, Mexico side, which now actually there's a similar encampment under the Biden administration of people trying to assert the right to seek asylum now, which is being flouted again by the Biden administration of about 1,500 people. So this is one of the first incarnations we saw of effectually an encampment of refugees who are being turned away from the US, and it's a problem that we have going on today as well. Here, in terms of strategies and campaigning alongside legal documentation, I was with a couple of colleagues here at several border crossings across the US. We erected big billboards that perverted or played off of a US Homeland Security phrase: if you see something, say something. It's counterterrorism. We say, si ves algo mal, di algo. If you see something bad, say something. And it says that every person has a right to seek asylum. And if you try to seek asylum at the U.S. border and were turned away, denounce it to Amnesty International. We created this forum to try to gather testimonies from people who've been turned back, to try to reach people whom we might not be able to reach because they've already been turned away and have been denied their rights. But this actually, in terms of strategies and campaigning and research, it turned out to be a better publicity stunt that got written up in some news wires than actually a research tool, because one of the mistakes we made was having an online forum that required people to have internet access through their browsers and their phones, rather than listing a WhatsApp number, which would have been the ideal way to reach communities of people on the move. The police didn't like our sign. We had to move it. Here's an example of a crowd of people waiting at the actual physical border, being turned away by US authorities there in Tijuana. I'll skip this one. Here again in Juarez is a mobile billboard driving around and encouraging people to denounce their denial of their rights to seek asylum at the border. Here's an interesting before and after. So in relation to what's happening in US courts, this was the day before a court laid down a ruling that said that, that issued a preliminary injunction and said that the US's, the Trump administration's new policy that no one would be allowed to claim asylum if they crossed irregularly was probably illegal. So they enjoined it. And the day after, actually overnight, when they rejected that and said that people could cross the border irregularly, here you can see the actual boundary marker between the US and Mexico. And overnight, they put in place razor wire, fortified the border, had riot teams come in to prevent anybody from accessing US territory, which, you know, students of refugee law already probably understand doesn't matter in terms of it still being a violation of the obligation of non-refoulement, but nonetheless, their theater of security and actual violence toward asylum seekers was quite on showcase. Here is a resulting shelter of a larger a caravan of migrants and asylum seekers in late 2018, when they were being systematically turned away and thousands of people started then getting stuck at the US-Mexico border. And, you know, to see what is on the other side here, this is actually I guess for comic material. Here's a shopping mall on the other side of the border. You can see why it's important to for the US to protect their shopping industry, but it's just a dramatic image of kind of the one side versus the other. These are images of child migrant shelters, which is a longer discussion. Again, I wanted to showcase this this border issue, right, and what it looks like, the pushbacks. And here you see the U.S.-Mexico borderline on a bridge between El Paso, Texas, and Juarez in Chihuahua, state of Mexico. And you can see that they've moved border officials right to the border to prevent people from crossing unless they have a legal right to enter the territory. It's not really a valid measure to try to abandon obligations to receive asylum seekers, but nonetheless, it's the one that the U.S. used, and it hasn't adequately been challenged in courts or otherwise to force them to receive asylum seekers, and still the U.S. is summarily expelling migrants and asylum seekers.
Sorry, Brian, but the screen is no longer sharing, and I think you've been talking
okay.
a blank screen, yes. But
I'm sorry.
We do have the link, and if anybody of our audience would like to actually get this link, we're happy to share it with them. Thank you very much for this very insightful talk. It's been really nice. Would you like to tell the audience any final remark before we close off?
I'm trying to restore my video here. I don't know quite how. Sorry about that. Okay, here we go. And thank you so much. I'm very grateful. Let me drop my my email in the chat box. In case anyone would like to be in touch about anything, I'm always happy to receive questions or have virtual coffees with folks. If anyone was stimulated by some of the issues discussed and would like to talk more. But it's been a great pleasure to chat with all of you. I'm sorry the photo showcase didn't work there. The struggle is real. Technology, Zoom. But nonetheless, it's been really an honor to join you virtually for this gathering, and hopefully we'll continue the discussion with some of you. I think you're on mute, Lars, but thank you too.